This is Kick-Ass News. I'm Ben Mathis. Hi, I'm Ben Mathis. Welcome to Kick-Ass News. CBS Sunday Morning correspondent and humorist Mo Rocca has always loved obituaries, reading about the memorable lives of global leaders, Hollywood heavyweights, and innovators who changed the world. But not every notable life has gotten the send-off it deserves. That inspired him to create his hit podcast, Mobituaries, and now he's continuing his quest to right that wrong with his new book, Mobituaries: Great Lives Worth Reliving. Today I'm delighted to welcome Mo Rocca on the show to talk about where his love of obituaries comes from. We discuss celebrities who died on the same day, historical figures who were eclipsed by the actors who played them in the movies, and the old debate over whether famous people die in pairs or threes. Mo tells the stories of lesser-known figures like Jimmy Carter's brother Billy, the original Siamese twins Ang and Chang, and the world's first fashion influencer. Plus the unceremonious send-off of founding father Thomas Paine, how Lawrence Welk proved it's hip to be square, and famous rest stops along the New Jersey Turnpike. Coming up with Mo Rocca in just a moment. Mo Rocca is a correspondent for CBS Sunday Morning, host of the Henry Ford's Innovation Nation, host and creator of the cooking channels My Grandmother's Ravioli, as well as a frequent panelist on NPR's hit weekly quiz show, Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. Prior to that, he spent 4 years as a correspondent on Comedy Central's The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and he was a writer and producer for the Emmy and Peabody Award-winning PBS children's series Wishbone. He's also the host of the popular Mobituaries podcast, which inspired him to write his latest book, Mobituaries: Great Lives Worth Reliving. Mo Rocca, welcome.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me.
Well, I really enjoyed this book because I love this kind of stuff. You just have an insane wealth of information and random historical trivia in your head. And I'm all about that. I drive my wife crazy all the time because, you know, for instance, we'll be like in Times Square and I have to tell her all about the statue of George M. Cohan, who probably no one stops and recognizes.
Right.
Or, yeah, we'll be at a steakhouse and I think at one point, there was a Diamond Jim Brady steak on the menu. And I'm like, let me tell you all about Diamond Jim Brady and how much food he would eat at breakfast at Delmonico's. And then I'm like, you don't know about Delmonico's? Delmonico's was the first restaurant in America and all this stuff. So,
the George M. Cohan, that's really interesting because I oftentimes feel like, and I live in New York, that statues that you know that people are just walking by not paying attention to, I wonder if they feel lonely, or what would it be if they – maybe that's that like night at the museum if they came to life. But I live down the street from the Stonewall, which, you know, is rightly now known as the birthplace of gay rights in America. But it's at Sheridan Square, and General Philip Sheridan, who was a Union general, his statue is right there, and you wonder, like, what would he think? I mean, maybe he'd be really cool with all of it and be like, yeah, there were a bunch of gay guys in the Union Army, and I'm glad they all have rights now.
Are you that guy who always has to stop at a historical marker?
I
read it?
became that person after
Really?
living, no offense, but after living in Texas, because
yeah?
I lived in Dallas, in the suburbs of Dallas, in
Oh, I didn't know
Plano.
that.
Yeah. And I was there for a great reason. I was working on a kids' TV show called Wishbone. But the part of Plano that I was living in, I mean, if something was pre-Watergate, it would have been ancient. I mean, everything had been paved over.
Right.
And it kind of depressed me. And so I'd grown up on the East Coast, and I said to myself, I think I really kind of actually said to myself, wherever I live from now on, I'm going to do my best to appreciate the history and that people lived and died in this place before me. And they had in Plano as well, but you wouldn't have known it. And so then I began really quite literally in cases stopping my car if I see a historic marker to read it.
I always, if I see something, I have to explain who. If I know it, I have to explain who it is. If I see some random reference, and for some reason, it's always in songs. Songs, there are just always a name that gets thrown out there that probably nobody knows, and then I'm the guy who has to look them up and find out who the hell was this.
Give me an example. I love what you're talking about. I wanted to do something like this for the book, and it didn't come together. But and I want to steal it.
What one actually is one who comes up in the book. Beau Brummel.
Yes.
I remember from Annie, there's a line in one of the songs, and it's like, your clothes may be Beau Brummely.
But you're never
and so
fully
I had
dressed
to
without
find
a
out who that
smile.
was. Yeah, and years ago, I used to own a letter by him, of all things. There's this letter where he's bemoaning the fact that he's traveling, but he doesn't have the wherewithal to have a gentleman's own, which I think was like a valet who would travel with you. Yeah,
but that's really interesting because Beau Brummel and Herbert Hoover, of course, also comes up in the musical Annie. And for a lot of people, it was their first exposure. Beau Brummel's also in the musical Gypsy. Tulsa, I think, sings in his big
yes.
Tulsa, the big number.
I sang that in high school.
Yes, what's
in
the song?
choir. It's once my clothes were shabby. Tailors called me cabby. Yeah, what was it?
Brummel.
Oh yeah, I'll be Beau Brummel. Yeah, yeah.
What's the title?
Gets a lot of musical play.
Yeah, he does. And I was thinking the other day of this Cole Porter song. As Dorothy Parker once said to her boyfriend, fare thee well. As Columbus announced when he knew he was pounced, it was swell, Isabel swell. As Abelard said to Eloise, don't forget to drop a line to me, please. As Romeo cried in his Juliet's ears, Romeo, why not face the facts, my dears? It was just one of those things. But anyway,
right, that's impressive that you know the
verse.
Yeah, the verse to it.
But and I think at one point I did look up who Abelard and Eloise were, and I think it's sort of. Is it Renaissance era or even earlier? I've forgotten, obviously. But this idea of names that pop up in songs, I'm into that. And you obviously are better about learning who they are.
Well, yeah. And Cole Porter is perfect for that because he was famous for, I don't know what they call them, the list song, the catalog songs where he just starts rattling off weird references that probably only a New York theater crowd would get.
Right. Yeah.
You started out in musical theater. Is that right?
I did. And that's what I thought I wanted to pursue in general, and I love musicals, and I kind of try to pull them in whenever I can. I've been on Broadway. I was in the 25th Annual Putnam County Spelling Bee. But yeah, my first professional jobs in, if we're going to lump media and entertainment together, and I'm fine doing that, was I toured in musicals and plays. I did a Bus and Truck of Lend Me a Tenor, a farce by Ken Ludwig. And then I went to Southeast Asia in the musical Grease.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I played duty in Jakarta, in Singapore, and in Hong Kong.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I think somewhere I read you did South Pacific at the Paper Mill. Is that right?
I did at Paper Mill Playhouse in New Jersey. I played the professor in South Pacific.
Be fun to do South Pacific in Southeast Asia.
I know, right?
Exactly.
And then to do Greece in Greece.
Yeah.
Instead of
exactly.
I mixed it all up.
Now, I want to give people some context in case they haven't read your book, Mobituaries, or listened to the podcast. For anyone who's not familiar, what is a Mobituary?
It's my spin on an obituary. It's an appreciation for someone or something that didn't get the send-off it deserved or isn't remembered in a way that I think it should be remembered. Obviously, objects, concepts, beliefs, and they're included in the book and in the podcast, don't get any kind of obituary, like the belief in dragons. That was kind of a fun thing I stumbled on, and that's one of the chapters in the book, and how in 1735, until that point, for millennia, people believed in dragons, and then largely due to one man, they stopped believing in dragons. That's one story. But then there are well-known names that I wanted to explore. People like Marlene Dietrich or Lawrence Welk that I think that are worth remembering. I mean, I think the sad fact is everyone will be forgotten pretty much, but I think there are lives that it would be nice to hold on to for a little bit longer at least. And also, I mean, honestly, it's a vehicle for me to write and talk about people that I'm interested in.
Yeah, I think the chapter for Lawrence Welk was something like Death of a Square.
Yeah.
I kind of found him a very likable square, as squares go.
Yeah.
You can do a lot worse than Lawrence Welk, because I watched them all in the reruns that they used to air on PBS of the Lawrence Welk show.
And they still run.
Wonderful.
Well, yeah,
Or wonderful.
Yeah, wonderful. He and I meant that in a very laudatory way. But what I found, it's like that Huey Lewis song, "Hip to be Square." But he, to me, embodied the virtues that I think young people oftentimes like to think that they embody, of like doing it my way, flouting the authorities. Well, Lawrence Welk actually did that. I mean, he had been on the road for decades with his band. Early on, he developed the idea of champagne music, that genre, and he was close to 50 when he first got on TV. I think it was first KTLA and then ABC. And the network wanted him to have an edgy warm-up comic. They wanted him to have big guest stars. They wanted all these things that he said no to, because he knew who he was and he knew what his audience liked. And nothing else mattered professionally to him and artistically. And when he got canned from the network, even though he still had a big audience, he didn't retire with his winnings. He kept going, and he lasted another 11 years in syndication and on PBS. And at the end of his run, he had, to that point, the longest-running musical variety show in history. It's since been eclipsed by Soul Train, and he was the second richest person in entertainment. And I don't admire him, after Bob Hope. I don't admire him for his riches. I admire him for the fact that he really stuck to his guns.
Yeah, they were able to milk that for a long time. Even after he died, years ago, I was in, of all places, Branson, Missouri, and there's a Lawrence Welk resort there, and they have a big theater, and all of these old Lawrence Welk stars get trotted on stage, like and they still perform. They had the one who used to play on the upright piano, and she still had the beehive. And
right.
Yeah, I can't remember her name.
And it's escaping me as well. And I'm gonna remember it. And she was replaced at one point, but he was many things you're not supposed to be in television. You know, the network didn't like what they thought of as quirky regionalism. Yeah. He kept his accent. He probably could have worked on losing it, although he didn't learn to speak English until he was 23. Oh, really? He was born in North Dakota in a German-speaking enclave.
Wow. Now, where does your interest in obituaries come from?
My interest comes from my father, for the most part. I don't know that I would have been interested in a lot of things had I not been raised by the parents that I was raised by. But my father had a real sense of the romance of life. And, you know, I'm certainly not the first person to say this. A good obituary is really about someone's life, not their death. I'm not all that interested in how people die. I'm interested in quirky things that I think are more than quirky. Like, we all have, I think many of us have a fascination with famous people dying on the same day, things like that. So I'm interested in stuff like that. But primarily, I'm interested in people's lives. If anything, I'm more interested in their beginnings than their ends.
You do a deep dive into, of all people, Billy Carter in here.
Yeah.
And apparently you talked to Jimmy Carter about him. You talked to his widow and his kids. You talked to Dan Rather, who had interviewed him. What is your fascination with Billy Carter? Why not Neil Bush or Roger Clinton or, I don't know, Elliot Roosevelt?
Right. Well, I name check a bunch of those guys. A presidential family is like a regular family on steroids. And I do think that we look to the presidency, you know, Jeff Greenfield once said this to me, the American presidency is both the head of government and the head of state. And oftentimes in other countries, like in the UK, those are split, you know, prime minister and queen, but we combine the two. And on the head of state side, we're looking to the person to be a symbol, hopefully a better version of ourselves. And I think that we look at presidential families, we sort of fixate on them and maybe see our own families writ large. And Billy Carter, 13 years younger than Jimmy Carter, was the black sheep. I mean, the whole family was super colorful. Miss Lillian, the mother, was an amazing figure.
Really?
I mean, their mother joined the Peace Corps and went to India when she was 68 years old. I mean, she was she was authentic before that word became leached of all meaning. I mean, she was like a real interesting lady and would go on Johnny Carson a lot. And but Billy had these crazy, blocky, black rimmed glasses. He smoked. He drank. He eventually marketed his own beer, Billy Beer, that Dan Rather told me even the dogs wouldn't drink. It was so bad. He was spectacle, and that's putting it nicely.
Yeah.
I actually think he was an asset probably at the beginning because Jimmy was, with all due respect, sort of the abstemious, ramrod straight, teetotaling kind of Boy Scout, whereas Billy was the good old boy.
Yeah.
Who almost you could hear it happening today. I mean, when Dan Rather goes to profile him in 1977, Billy Carter's he's essentially mocking the press, telling Dan Rather to his face that TV reporters are told what to say by their producers.
Wow,
I mean,
he was ahead of its time.
He really was ahead of his time. I mean, and Billy eventually, when his brother Jimmy was at the worst point of his presidency, when Jimmy was being challenged for renomination within his own party by Ted Kennedy, when there were hostages in Iran, Billy starts consorting with representatives of the government of Libya, a hostile government. So Jimmy Carter has to give an hour-long press conference to the nation explaining why his brother has been meddling, explaining why his younger brother has been meddling in the Middle East. And
wow.
And I mean, that's just, again, like a regular family on steroids. I wanted to find out who Billy Carter was. I talked to President Carter. I talked, as you mentioned, to Billy's widow and 6 kids, and they described a man who was funny, who was smart, who was hardworking, who, when his brother became president, he didn't ask his brother to run for office. He had no choice in the matter. The family business in this small town of Plains, Georgia, went into a blind trust, as quaint as that sounds these days. And Billy Carter had no choice but to make his living being Billy Carter and playing the redneck. And I mean, that was a difficult position. He eventually admitted he was an alcoholic and spent the last part of his life traveling the country, counseling and speaking to people who could relate to him who were also alcoholics. So he was, of course, a fully fleshed out human being.
And I know that presidential history is kind of your thing, but you also have a chapter in here about those who campaigned for president and never quite made it to the White House.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite presidential also-ran?
That's a great question. I know William Jennings Bryan. I mean, he tries 3 times,
Right.
and then he's on the wrong side of the evolution debate. So I wouldn't call him a favorite. I'm a more Clarence Darrow type. Shirley Chisholm is, to me, fascinating. The first African American woman elected to Congress and to run for president in 1972. She's very interesting to me for a few reasons. One of which is that when she's elected to Congress, she sort of shunted on to the Agriculture Committee. And it's like, what is this woman who, is representing an urban district doing on the Agriculture Committee? And she turns, appropriately enough, lemons into lemonade, I guess, because she decides she's going to revamp the food stamp program and she's going to use that perch. So she's kind of ingenious how she takes the limitations imposed on her and turns them into assets. And then she develops this unlikely friendship with George Wallace, who had been a segregationist. And when he's shot, she goes and visits him in his hospital room. So it's sort of extraordinary that there hasn't been. I think there's going to be a biopic made of her.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I wanted to include a whole section in the book. I didn't get to it of biopics that should be made that would win someone an Oscar, because there are a whole bunch of stories out there.
Yeah, what do you think would be at the top of your list?
I think Nellie Bly would be one, the crusading, muckraking journalist.
Right, who went into the nut house. Well, I don't want to be on PC.
Go
into
ahead.
a mental.
Call it a nut
back
house.
then, they would have called it a nut house.
10 days. She wrote 10 Days in a Madhouse, and she went incognito. She passed herself off as mentally as crazy, right? As insane, I should say.
Yeah,
right. She passed herself
too well in some ways.
Yeah, exactly. And then she, I think, inspired by Jules Verne, she went around the world in fewer than 80 days.
Wow.
So she, a fascinating life. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I forget. It wasn't Hearst. Was it Pulitzer that was her publisher?
It was Pulitzer. Yeah.
Yeah. So Pulitzer had to intervene because she couldn't get out. She had done such a good crazy act.
Right.
Apparently.
That's right. So it's a great story.
Yeah, that's wild. Now, I think one of the first people that you profile in here is, of all people, Thomas Paine, who is someone that I don't really think of as being overlooked, but apparently at the time of his death, he had a pretty ignoble send-off, right?
Yeah, only 6 people showed up at his funeral, and the obituary in a newspaper called The American Citizen was very short and read, in part, he had lived long, done some good, and much harm. In a way, I was drawn to Thomas Paine because, for whatever reason, I didn't find him an appealing figure. I found the idea of him way too cerebral. I felt no warmth. I'm usually drawn. I like to think of being on a beach with a metal detector, and if it goes off, that's where the heat and the warmth is, right, for me. And
Yeah.
Thomas Paine sort of left me cold, I think, because of how he's suffered throughout history, posthumously. And so I wanted to take that on and think, well, wait a minute. I know he's important, and there's a reason I'm resistant to him, and that made me want him even more. But I think it is. I've learned there were several things about him that are not demerits or defects in character that are the reason why we don't remember him as a first-tier founding father.
Really?
Primarily, it was his dalliances with the French Revolution after the American Revolution that turned the other founding fathers against him. I mean, it's important to point out that he wrote Common Sense, the pamphlet Common Sense.
Of course.
It was published about 6 months before the Declaration of Independence, and it made the case in language that was broadcast worthy today, very clear for a largely illiterate population, so it could be read out loud. It made the case to citizens, to colonists, why they should band together against the crown. Until that point, among other things, they didn't view themselves as Americans. They viewed themselves as, New Jerseyans or, Georgians or New Yorkers. And he said he made the case that we, our forebears, all had common cause. And he rebranded the word American, which one of his biographers told me at that point meant, quote, cracker hillbilly, and gave it and rebranded it as something good. And he asked the question, why is it that a continent should be ruled by an island, and asked smart, common sense questions. The pamphlet, based on the population then, is one of, if not the highest selling publication in American history, highest selling American publication, I should say, in American history. But he only, it seems, had one setting as an activist, as a revolutionary, as an agitator. He didn't know how to transition, or didn't want to, I should say, into statesmanship. The others went from being agitators and revolutionaries and putting their lives at risk to building a government. He wasn't interested in that. He was interested in moving on to the next cause. So he's sort of that guy at dinner that only wants to talk about the issues. And you're kind of like, I know this is important, but can we please just maybe talk about reality TV? Can we just take a little bit of a break?
Yeah. Okay.
He didn't have that
sort
setting.
of a downer, or not a downer, but
he was 100. Yes, and he was 100%. And when he was in France, he wrote, the last straw for many of the founding fathers was a book he wrote called Age of Reason that refuted the divinity of Christ, trashed organized religion, said a lot of what the founding fathers were saying in private and were shrewd enough not to say in public.
Wow. And apparently his remains kind of got spread off into the wind or something, right?
Yeah, his bones, even after his death, he did have cultists. He had partisans, people who liked him, even though he was largely unpopular. His bones were stolen from their grave in New Rochelle, New York. And through the years, they've been scattered all over. There's a market for them. He has, you can't call, he's not left or right in modern terms. I mean, there are plenty of progressives, and then there's Glenn Beck on the right. I mean, that are equally ardent about their love of Thomas Paine.
We're going to take a quick break, and then I'll be back with more with Mo Rocca when we come back in just a minute. Nick Offerman and Megan Mullally have a brand new podcast on Earwolf. It's called In Bed with Nick and Megan. Your favorite celebrity couple is giving everyone a rare and candid look into their life and relationship. In this hilarious and intimate show, listeners will feel like they're in bed with Nick and Megan because that's exactly where every episode is recorded, in their actual bedroom. In Bed with Nick and Megan features hilarious guests like Bill Hader, Lisa Kudrow, Retta, Nick Kroll, and so many more. In some episodes, they even turn the intimate discussion onto each other, leaving the crew in the room to wonder if maybe they should just go. In Bed with Nick and Megan is out now, so check it out on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Looking for some sparkle under the tree? Finding the perfect gift for everyone on your list can be a difficult task, but it doesn't have to be. Kendra Scott is here to help make your shopping this season as easy as possible with a great selection of gifts for everyone on your list. From a classic pendant necklace to an on-trend statement earring or something customized, they've got pieces for every style and budget, including hundreds of styles under $100. Best of all, Kendra Scott offers free shipping, plus free gift wrapping and free returns just in case. Want some personal shopping advice? Visit your local Kendra Scott store and they'll help you find the right jewelry for you or your loved ones, or go to their website and take their perfect gift finder quiz. And our gift to you, visit kendrascott.com and use promo code KICK or mention this ad in your local Kendra Scott store for 20% off your next purchase. Hurry, this is a limited time offer. That's 20% off at kendrascott.com using the promo code KICK. On average, over 27,000 Americans are diagnosed with breast cancer every month. Invitae believes that's 27,000 too many. That's why they're helping more people take control of their health through medical quality genetic testing. Whether that means continuing your current health routine or starting mammograms earlier, your results can give you confidence that you're taking the right steps for you. Learn more and order your kit today at Invitae.com. That's INVITAE.com. And now, back to the show. You give a whole chapter here, too, of all people, Ang and Chang. A little more obscure, but I knew they were pretty much the original Siamese twins, right?
Well, they're the conjoined twins for whom Siamese twins, that moniker was established. They came from,
because they were Siamese.
Yeah, they came from exactly. Yes. They came from Siam, what is now Thailand, and they were two of the first entertainers in America. They were two of the very first Asians in America, well predating the Chinese that would come here to build the railroad. And their lives are I call them really it's death of an American story. They're immigrants. They, against all odds, pull themselves up by their bootstraps, win their freedom. They come over essentially as indentured servants. They become, as I said, two of the first entertainers. So it's a very American story. They marry. They marry sisters who are not conjoined, but they married sisters. They have Ang and his wife have 11 children. Chang and his wife have 10.
Wow. How do you have carnal relations when you're a conjoined twin?
Yeah, they had something called they developed what the author Yunto Wang told me was a system called alternate mastery. And so they each had their own home, and they would spend 3 days and 3 nights at one home, and they'd switch to the other. So when they were in, let's say they were in Ang's home, Chang would be there with Ang and his wife, and Chang would go into what I call like a computer sleep mode. Okay. So he would just sort of surrender all willpower so that his brother could be the man of the house and have relations with his wife. And then the reverse would happen at Chang's house, where Ang would go into this sort of sleep mode. And it is fascinating. And the two questions everybody has about them is how did they die and how did they reproduce? But on the subject of their having sex, I actually think it's pretty moving that one brother would do that for the other. Mm-hmm. I mean, and the way that they negotiated the world physically, because the band of flesh that connected their respective sternums was about, I think, 5.5 inches long, which it had stretched over the course of their lives, but it was still pretty short. But they'd have to have one arm over the other's shoulder. So imagine like two friends coming home from a late night out drinking, just kind of, coming home. So it's a moving story, but what makes the story to me even more compelling or worth telling is that after marrying and having children, they become slave owners, which is the part of the story that they have a farm in North Carolina, obviously pre-Civil War, and
that was probably the immigrant dream, though.
For a Southern, they were, as Yunta Wong told me, they became honorary whites and Southern gentlemen, and it's a part of the story that is obviously difficult for a lot of people today, but I do think in a way they kind of represent America, the good and the bad, all of it. And it's kind of amazing how so much of it is packed into one story.
Yeah, and P.T. Barnum put him on the map. Is that right?
He didn't put them on the map.
There was a Barnum connection.
They predated P.T. Barnum in the first stage of their career. Then by the time they had retired from showbiz, P.T. Barnum had become a big deal, and the Freak Show had become a big deal. And then all of their money, Chang and Ang, all their money was in Confederate war bonds. And so they were financially devastated by the Civil War, and they had to, at an advanced age, go back on the road. They were bitter about this, and by that point, they had to work with P.T. Barnum, and they hated him.
Really?
Yeah, and it was a great humiliation. Chang finally suffered a stroke, and for the last couple of years of their lives, Ang had to quite literally drag him around.
Wow. Now, you also have a section in here on, of all things, the various people in history for whom rest stops on the New Jersey Turnpike have been named. Yeah. First of all, how many are there?
There are 12. I think I have that right. But there are 12. There are 12. You might want to check me on that, but I believe there are 12. New Jersey, I did a piece for CBS Sunday Morning on New Jersey. And New Jersey, I did it during the Snooki, what was it? Jersey Shore.
Oh, right.
That show.
Yeah, Jersey Shore.
I sound so old. The Snooki show. And a lot of people only experience New Jersey on that turnpike. They're just driving through. And Benjamin Franklin had called New Jersey a barrel being tapped at both ends because it basically grew food for people in Philadelphia and New York City. And then the people in those cities dumped their trash in New Jersey. So New Jersey has never really gotten the credit and love it deserves. And, when people – and so those rest stops, I thought they called them quite in an un-New Jersey way, service stations. No one in New Jersey calls them service stations. They're rest stops. Yeah. But I wanted to find out who those people were. And in one case, James Fenimore Cooper has a stop. He wrote The Last of the Mohicans. But then John Fenwick, who I didn't know until I did this, he established the first Quaker colony in the Americas. And I thought – John Fenwick and James Fenimore Cooper are way too similar sounding, and I'm imagining a Twitter hookup. I'm imagining a Tinder hookup and a budding romance, and saying, meet me at the James Fenimore Cooper rest stop,
right?
And one person accidentally going to John Fenwick and waiting basically at the wrong Auntie Anne's, and so I propose in the book. Replacing John Fenwick with Meryl Streep, who is a great
from New Jersey.
Yeah, so there are other people.
Yeah, what about the boss?
Springsteen doesn't have one.
Yeah, he doesn't get a rest stop.
I love Springsteen and I love Howard Stern, who campaigned for a stop at one point.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Woodrow Wilson, who is one of those characters who really is unlikable, and and not just because he segregated the federal government. It had not been. It had been integrated until he came along, the first Southern Democrat to take office since the Civil War, and screening the birth of a nation in the White House. He was, in addition to that, there was something. I don't know. Maybe it was how is it pronounced? Pince nez, those strange little glasses he wore.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I can't cozy up to Woodrow Wilson. I'm a much more of a Teddy Roosevelt guy. But anyway, he has a rest stop, and I propose also renaming that for a guy named Thomas Mundy Peterson, who was actually the first black man in America to ever cast a vote, and he was in New Jersey.
Oh, really?
In the city of Perth Amboy, he cast a vote. So anyway, these are if I can just get people to pay attention. I don't know. I know I don't need to get you to pay attention because you're right inclined to. But seriously,
you have all of my attention right now. I find this fascinating.
Yeah, but I think it's it is a little bit of a shame that all around us, if you're lucky to live in a community that has plaques and statues, there are reminders of the people who lived before us. And I don't know, if I can just encourage people, and I should take more time myself, just stop, read, and go, that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, we all should. Now, on a more serious note, you have a chapter in here called Death of a Diagnosis, which bids a not-so-fond farewell to the American Psychiatric Association's designation of homosexuality as a mental illness, which I think ended in 1973. Now, I know in your personal life you came out a few years ago. Where was this on your timeline? Would that have made an impact on you when that happened?
I only found out much later, and in that chapter about homosexuality being removed from the DSM, which still exists, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the American Psychiatric Association's catalog of mental illnesses. Homosexuality was included from its beginning in 1952. It certainly had been considered by many a mental illness well before that. And the leadership voted to remove it in 1973, and then the membership ratified that the next year. That next year, 1974, just happened to be the year that we got a set of World Book Encyclopedia in my home, and my family, my parents bought it. And I cherish the 1974 World Book. I really cherish it.
I remember those. Barely.
Yeah.
I haven't seen one in probably 2 decades.
I feel so bad for kids that didn't grow up with it.
Know.
Because I used to love to come home from school and lie on my stomach on the red carpet in the family room and page through the World Book and read the facts in brief about different countries. But I used to pull the H volume off and read the homosexuality entry, and it was pitifully short. It was, but read it over and over again. I think even at first, when I first read it, I intuited that it was about me. Then I realized it really was about me. But this is probably when I was 11 or 12 years old. I wasn't reading it as a 5-year-old in 1974. So, but I read it over and over again. And the entry, in retrospect, it didn't damage me deeply. I mean, the entry, it said things like, sometimes two homosexuals can form a relationship almost like a marriage, almost in an incredulous tone. Or, and it pointed out quite factually that in some parts of the world it was punished harshly. But this was just my personal way in on telling the story about the heroes who got it removed from the DSM. So little did I know that the year we got that World Book Encyclopedia was a pivotal year in that battle. Yeah,
and of course, like pretty much all gay men, you are a huge fan of Barbra Streisand.
I own the stereotype. I own it. I have no problem with it. And I worry about younger gay men who aren't huge Barbra Streisand fans.
Oh yeah,
yeah. I mean, I don't know who they're fans of, but have.
Who would you be a fan of?
I guess you'd be a fan probably Lady Gaga, and then and on from there. Maybe who's the woman? The Ariana Grande. She's great, and she's and she's really talented. And so I think,
but she's not into the camp of it and the costumes like Lady Gaga is. So I can't quite picture her.
And look, I think as cliched as it sounds, I'm a crazy huge Barbra Streisand fan. I got to meet her once, and unfortunately, the one thing she asked me is, "What should we do about climate change?" And I mean, and I was a real dud. I couldn't give her a really great answer. I mean, who has a great answer on this?
Right.
But it still was worth the excitement of meeting her. And I had interviewed Arthur Lawrence years ago. Arthur Lawrence wrote the book
Funny Girl, right?
He didn't write Funny. He wrote the book for Gypsy and West Side Story, and he wrote The Way We Were.
Oh, The Way We Were, right.
Yeah,
right.
And he also happened to direct her in her off-Broadway debut in I Can Get It For You Wholesale, and it's kind of a legendary audition story where she came in and she started singing, and she was sort of smacking gum when she walked in, and then she took the gum out of her mouth and put it underneath a stool, like to show real chutzpah. And then she started singing, and everybody melted, and they kept her there for hours while she just kept singing. And then she was in this show playing Miss Marmalstein, and then that led to Funny Girl. And then when they checked the chair afterwards, there was no gum there. It was all a routine. It was
that's funny.
So, but in attitude, but that went along with just a volcanic talent. And but Arthur Lawrence said to me about Barbara, I'm just going to call her Barbara, even if I gave her a lousy answer on what to do about climate change. But Arthur said about Barbara, he said she was the first Jewish star. And of course, she wasn't the first Jewish star. And Fanny Brice, the woman she played in Funny Girl, was probably the first in modern media, I guess.
Certainly the first female. I guess there was like Al Jolson and Eddie Cantor on the guy's side.
Eddie Cantor so much. Yeah. If you knew Susie like I knew Susie, oh boy. He's
a good one for the sequel.
Yeah, I love it. Well, and also Eddie Cantor really helped Sammy Davis Jr.
Really, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he did. And Eddie Cantor with the Will Maston trio. I think he had them all on an early show, and maybe even. I don't know if he introduced them at Ciro's, but he made a real point of promoting them and ignoring kind of the tradition of segregation entertainment then.
Interesting.
And he really helped and helped Sammy Davis Jr. But Fanny Brice, I was interested in the story in the story of Fanny Brice because when I saw Funny Girl, and when I think about Funny Girl and what an extraordinary performance Streisand turns in, I forget that it's a story of Fanny Brice. A strange thing happens. I can't speak for anyone else except every other gay man on the planet. But when you watch Funny Girl, you begin to believe that you're watching the story of the rise of Barbra Streisand. So it's something happens, and that's not because she's not committing to the character. It's just because the performance is so extraordinary, and because it was a film debut, so it eclipses Fanny Brice to such a degree that Fanny Brice sort of gets lost. It's still definitely an Oscar-worthy performance, but look, you watch the movie Patton. George C. Scott is great.
Right.
If we talk about
thing, right?
Yeah, well, except that you don't forget you're watching the story of General Patton. Now, if I talk about
true.
If I talk about General Patton now, you're going to picture George C. Scott. If I talk about T.E. Lawrence, you're going to picture Peter O'Toole, and those performances are great. But you're never not aware of whose story you're watching.
Okay.
With Funny Girl, a strange thing happens, and you think you're watching. A friend of mine pointed out that something similar happens with Mommy Dearest, and I actually think he's right. Yeah. That you forget that it's a story of Joan Crawford. You think it's the story of Faye Dunaway, and that is also a great performance. But with Funny Girl, it's clearly I was very invested in this idea, but I wanted to tell the story of Fanny Brice, and I like this sort of biblical. I don't know. I've tried this on other people, and people aren't buying it, and they think I'm being tongue-in-cheek, and I'm not. But you have Moses, who leaves Egypt for the Promised Land, but he doesn't make it there. Joshua completes the journey. And I think history is filled with what I call forgotten forerunners, people who sort of begin a journey, and then it's picked up by somebody else. Moses Fleetwood Walker is the first Black man to play what passes for Major League Baseball in the 1880s in Toledo. The Toledo Blue Stockings, the team he plays for, gets elevated to the American Association. That's the MLB of its time. That's what inspires the color line to be drawn in the first place. And then Jackie Robinson comes along 63 years later, and he breaks it. But somebody pointed out to me, they said you can't break a color line unless one is drawn in the first place. And history is filled with these little pockets of progress and these forerunners that have been forgotten. And in a certain way, Barbara sort of completes the journey that Fanny Brice begins. Fanny Brice becomes a Ziegfeld Folly, which is the SNL, the Saturday Night Live of its time.
Right.
She makes a virtue of her unusual looks. She's not a beauty. Let's just be blunt here. I'm not going to be PC about it. She's not pretty. But she's funny. And the Dance of the Seven Veils at the time is this unspeakably scandalous dance that debuts along with Richard Strauss's Salome opera. She has a young Irving Berlin, Israel Beilen is his name at that point, he writes a song, Sadie Salome Go Home, where she makes fun of herself for being a gawky woman trying to do this sexy dance. So Fanny Brice becomes this great comedic star, and she's suddenly performing alongside W.C. Fields. And I think Eddie Cantor may be part of it. But definitely W.C. Fields.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting that she became, a famous star in the Ziegfeld Follies because she was kind of the anti-Ziegfeld girl. Glorifying the American girl was like the motto of the Ziegfeld Follies. And they would all have these great beauties in next to nothing or nothing sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's what's so canny and kind of marvelous about Fanny Brice, that she makes a virtue of her unlikeliness. But she can never be a leading woman. And it's not just because of the time she lived in. I don't want to be pat about this and saying, well, Barbara was lucky to be born at a different time. Barbara's more talented. Fanny Brice was funny, but ask Alexa to play My Man by Fanny Brice, and it's maybe for the time I know it was a big deal, but there's no comparison.
Yeah, but she was talented. Every now and then I'll find an old recording that I enjoy. What was it? There was another Irving Berlin song that I think she did that was something like. He's not so good in the sun, but it's all about how in an easy chair
surprised.
This guy would. Yeah, you'd be surprised.
And who you should listen to sing that is Madeline Kahn sings it.
Oh, does she?
On YouTube. And Madeline,
I think
Madeline Kahn.
I think I have seen that. Wasn't that like at Irving Berlin's 100th birthday or something on CBS? I think.
Yeah, and she's she's
great.
Wonderful. Well, the whole thing, that whole eclipsing thing, Marlene Dietrich sings Boys in the Back Room and Destry Rides Again. But when Madeline Kahn parodies it as I'm Tired and Blazing Saddles, the thing that's so great about Madeline Kahn is she could have been probably a light opera singer. I mean, she chose to train her virtuosity on comedy. But, I don't like when people do comedic songs but can't sing. And Madeline Kahn was a legitimately great singer. And every moment of I'm Tired and Blazing Saddles, every moment counts.
Yeah.
And she does eclipse Marlene Dietrich there.
Yeah, she's so flawless in that. Now, I have to ask you something that I always argue with people about. Do celebrities die in pairs or in threes? I say threes, but a lot of people say pairs.
Well, they die in threes, but it's rare that you have three die on the same day. Now, Billy Wilder, Dudley Moore, and Milton Berle died on the same day. And interestingly enough, they never none of them ever worked together, not even as a pair.
Yeah.
So they never crossed paths, even though in different ways.
Although I knew Milton Berle from the Friars Club, and he used to claim that the closing line in Some Like It Hot came from him, that he gave Billy Wilder that line. So I just came up with a connection for you.
Wow, thank you.
Because what was it? When Jack Lemmon reveals that he's a man, he says, "I'm a man," and the other guy says, "Well, nobody's perfect."
Nobody's perfect. That's great.
He claimed that he was responsible for that line.
Well, I hope we go into a second printing, and you're definitely getting an acknowledgement for that. And then John F. Kennedy dies on the same day, is killed on the day that Aldous Huxley and C.S. Lewis die. And it's very hard to find this out. It's hard to verify this, but I do wonder how long it took for most people to realize that those other two men had died.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
And these were both big deals.
Yeah. And you also have a Mobituary in here for Von Meter, who was literally his whole act was his Kennedy impression, and pretty much Kennedy and his act died on the same day, right?
Yeah. Von Meter was a household name. He was the star of one of the first comedy albums ever called The First Family, which was, in retrospect, a completely and totally affectionate, but also funny spoof of this young, exciting, beautiful family, the Kennedys. Von Meter was a not good stand-up comic, a not good singer who had an uncanny ability to imitate John F. Kennedy. And the producers of this album, and Bob, oh God, forgive me, I'm forgetting his name suddenly, but the producers, one of whom is still alive, told me the story of finding Von Meter after he was on a summer replacement show. He was at the end of a lackluster set on a CBS TV show. He did his John F. Kennedy. The producers of this would-be album said, "There's our man." the album was a sensation and was for a while the biggest selling album of all time.
Yeah.
It was a huge
Comedy or music, right?
Sorry?
And not just the biggest comedy album.
Yeah. Comedy
Yeah.
albums are very new. Bob
Right.
Newhart had won the Grammy for Album of the Year with his debut comedy album. But no, The First Family outsold everything
Yeah.
for
Wow.
a while. And when Kennedy was murdered, Von Meter began really what was another biblical reference, 40 years in the desert. He lived significantly for another 40 years, a living reminder of a horrible incident, a horrible tragedy, and was shunned. And in the CBS News archives, we had a long, harrowing interview that he gave towards the end of his life, almost none of which had ever aired. It was for an erstwhile cable channel. So it was really gold, undiscovered until we found it. And we built a podcast episode in our first season of Mobituaries, the podcast around this. And the reason I was drawn to the story, other than how haunting and eerie and powerful it is he also represented a kind of a passing of a kind of comedy. When I was in high school, my high school history teacher, used to say everything changed that day, and America lost even more of its innocence that day. And what was so striking is watching the appearances he made on Jack Paar when when Kennedy was alive, and that both Jack Paar or whoever the host was and Von Meter would essentially ask forgiveness of the audience before going into the imitation of him.
Really?
Because it was considered so risque, so scandalous to just imitate the president.
Wow.
And, I don't want to go back to those days, but like in a lot of things, I think its passing should be acknowledged.
Yeah. Apparently, I guess Kennedy took it in stride. He just kind of laughed it off and thought he was funny. It's hard to imagine the current president doing that with Alec Baldwin, but
yeah. He did. Kennedy sort of at one point in a press conference said he thought it sounded more like Teddy, but he was sort of ribbing him. He wasn't being nasty about it. Yeah. Jackie, Mrs. Kennedy, did not like it.
Oh, really?
The fact that there were actors that they had totally innocently playing John and Caroline. I mean, nothing untoward about it at all. I mean, so innocent. But it was a different time. So she thought the idea even of the children being represented, even with cute little lines, very few in the comedy album, was beyond the pale.
Interesting. Well, before we go, I have to ask, what would you want your own, well, I don't want to say Mobituary because we want you to get your due in the first time around. So what would you want your own obituary to say?
I've thought about this, and I think what I'd like it to say is some version of Mo Rocca, who made other people interested in things they didn't expect to be interested in, died today. He was 135. Something like that. I've never known really when people say, "What are you?" And I take that question positively. I hope it's meant positive.
You do a lot of things, though.
Yeah,
I mean, CBS Sunday Morning, a cooking show, all these things.
Yeah.
You have you host the National Geographic Bee. You start on Broadway.
Right. Well, I don't know. It sounds trite. I like to do things that are interesting to me, and I hope that if I execute them well enough, that other people will become interested in them. So I don't know what that makes me, but this is a good time for me. I'm having a great. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to after many years, as he takes a drag on his cigarette in this business, to kind of to pursue the subjects, the topics that are interesting, whether they're happy or sad or best of all, a mix of the two.
Yeah. Since you brought it up, then I have to ask, do you still have a bucket list gig or something that you're just dying to do eventually?
I'd like to go back on Broadway. I like live performance. I've liked talking about the book in front of crowds.
Yeah.
So I would like to do that. I like performing, and I consider everything that I do performative. I know that some journalists kind of look askance at that. They think, it's not acting what we're doing. And I'm not saying it is. And but I do think when I interview people for CBS Sunday Morning, it is performative in that, and any good performance is truthful. So it's not make-believe, but you're engaging with another person. And if you're doing it right, then the audience will find it compelling.
Mm-hmm.
It's right, and it's a scene.
Once again, the book is called Mobituaries, Great Lives Worth Living, and folks can also subscribe to your podcast, Mobituaries. Mo Rocca, thanks for talking with me.
Ben, thank you very much. This has been really nice.
Thanks again to Mo Rocca for coming on the show. Order his new book, Mobituaries, Great Lives Worth Reliving, on Amazon, Audible, or wherever books are sold. Subscribe to the Mobituaries podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you like to listen. You can also catch Mo on CBS Sunday Morning and follow him on Twitter at Mo Rocca. If you enjoyed today's podcast, be sure to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and rate and review us while you're there. 5-star ratings and detailed reviews are one of the best ways for new listeners to discover the show. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at KickassNewsPod and recommend us to your friends on your social media. For more fun stuff, visit kickassnews.com, and I welcome your comments, questions, and suggestions at comments@kickassnews.com. For now, I'm Ben Mathis, and thanks for listening to Kick-Ass News.